Welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel Podcast. I'm Carl Zha, your host. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Warwick Powell. Dr. Warwick, for people who may not be familiar with you, could you give a very quick, brief introduction of yourself? What do you do, etc.?
Sure. Thanks very much for the invitation, Carl, to come onto the show. I've been a fan for a long time. I wear two hats basically, but the hats overlap. One hat is as an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, where I get involved in research mainly at the intersection of supply chains, digital systems, payments, and political economy. So a lot of the work that I've done in that area relates to how new technologies in IoT, blockchains, distributed ledgers affect the way that supply chains work in a systemic sense. The other hat that I wear is that I'm the founding chair of a research and development company called Smart Trade Networks, which seeks to take some of the ideas that we develop through research and develop them as first generation technical applications that can then be introduced to the wider world. And through that, we try to work with enterprises, entrepreneurs, and supply chains, particularly in developing countries, so that they have pathways to digitalization and getting more engaged in the opportunities of global trade. So they're the two hats that I wear. They usually overlap, and that gives me both a passion for and also a need to keep an eye on what's going on in the world.
Well, I have known you for a long time, Dr. Warwick, and you are an expert on China, and particularly China-US relations. So the reason I brought you here today is because Donald Trump recently had a summit with President Xi Jinping in South Korea, and this concludes the second round of U.S.-China trade war. I want to get your take on the result of the meeting. I mean, Trump, of course, he claimed victory. He claimed it was 12 out of 10. But it looks like China is getting whatever they want, didn't they?
Look, I think that there's a few ways of looking at this particular summit. Firstly, it comes on the back of what is in essence a 7-month roller coaster. 7 months because this roller coaster really started with the Liberation Day tariffs that President Trump announced unilaterally on the 2nd of April. And ever since then, there's been an up and down process where China responded in kind, the Americans escalated, China responded, etc., etc. And then there have been a number of meetings that tried to at least take things back to 2nd of April and enable the parties to engage each other in a de-escalated environment, which is what happened. We then had the meeting of the trade teams. When was that? That was in Kuala Lumpur, a few days before the Trump and Xi summit, which in effect did the heavy lifting as far as working through the issues, agreeing the issues, working through the frameworks on what the agreements were going to be. And by that, clearly what they meant was what the reciprocal measures that the parties would take as a way of normalizing the relationships again. The agreement that ultimately was announced on the back of the summit really involved a winding back of the clock to the pre-Liberation Day environment, as well as the removal of a couple of things that were announced subsequent to that, particularly the 301 measures that the United States introduced concerning the application of additional fees for ships that would dock in American ports, provided that the ships were made in China, they would be levied. And the aim of that ostensibly was to enable or incentivize the rejuvenation of an American shipbuilding industry. Whether any of this has merits or not is probably something we can go into, but certainly that was the objective. China's sort of coup de grace as far as bringing the issues actually to a head was the 9th of October announcements concerning rare earth and other materials export licensing regimes. Now, bear in mind that back in May, China had already introduced some licensing around things like dysprosium. So this wasn't actually the first set of rare earths that had been brought to the table, so to speak, during the course of the last 7 months. But it really did get the Americans' attentions. Their reactions were clearly apoplectic. The proposed licensing regimes went to the very heart of the American military-industrial complex supply chain system. And you could see that the United States was incredibly disrupted and anxious as a result of all this. The end result, I guess, is a 12-month cessation of hostilities, if it holds. The second thing is, in my view, the result is really an indication that Trump economics is being one tariff at a time sliced and diced away. So obviously there are still tariffs in place, but when you put it into the context of the fact that tariffs was the centerpiece of Trump's national economic rejuvenation strategy, it was a response to a particular view about American malaise, which is that de-industrialization occurred because foreign countries took advantage of America, and that tariffs was the means by which the United States would turn the tables and engender a large-scale process of reindustrialization through reshoring. If that was the case, and if there was genuine belief that tariffs was the centerpiece policy instrument for those objectives, well, I think you can kiss that all goodbye. The levels of tariffs that we now have, both in absolute terms and in relative terms between the tariffs being applied on goods from different countries, means that Americans will end up with a higher cost situation, but there will not be sufficient mechanisms to incentivize the reshoring that was anticipated. So Donald Trump has ensured that there are tariffs now as part of the trading landscape, but the tariff levels really only hurt American households and American enterprises without even going anywhere towards the incentives that they were supposed to create for reshoring. He could be happy with that, I guess. One last thing I should mention, and that goes to the agreements from China to begin purchasing American soybeans again. The levels that have been agreed to are a little bit more, or roughly half of what was the case a few years ago. I guess this is the case of the arsonist now coming in as the fire brigade, having destroyed America's soybeans trade with China and having recovered half of it. They're now claiming victory. And from the point of view of Scott Bessent the peasant, if you will, this is a good outcome.
Prior to the second round of escalation and now backing down from Trump administration, there was already a ceasefire or truce in place. That was implemented when Bessent chased the Chinese vice premier all the way to Europe, and first to Geneva and then to London. Why then did the second, the escalation that broke the truce fire? I mean, the ceasefire, the trigger, as far as I could tell, was U.S. implementing the BIS 50% rule, which greatly expanded the number of Chinese companies that could be placed on American entity list. I think it went from some 1,400 Chinese companies on the blacklist to over 20,000 Chinese companies on the blacklist. And that actually also prompted the Dutch government to seize Nesperia, a Chinese semiconductor firm from its Chinese parent company, and causing huge disruption in the semiconductor supply chain. And that, in part, led to China to retaliate with expanded rare earth export control. Now, why did you think that Trump administration did that? I mean, why did they roll out that BIS 50% rule? Did they just not think that China would retaliate? I mean,
look, it's hard to get inside the head of the Trump administration, and perhaps it's also worth bearing in mind that perhaps it doesn't always think with one mind. The BIS 50% rule question came out of Lutnick's ministry, and I think we've seen over the course of the last 7 or 8 months the the conduct of Lutnick in terms of his demeanor, his ability to engage in diplomacy, and an ability to, in a sense, conduct himself in a tone that would be conducive to constructive outcomes. All of that was absent. He tended to be somebody who went onto the global stage, persistently gloating about America having the cards, threatening the Chinese side, and I guess ultimately coming out of his ministry or his department, we had these measures. Perhaps, and to give the White House the benefit of the doubt, the White House was taken a little bit by surprise by all of this as well. And I suggest that that may have been the case, and it's only a hypothesis on my part, because it seems that often things happen in the United States government that don't seem to be particularly well coordinated. The initiatives coming out of one agency don't seem to mesh with those coming out of another. The different secretaries often seem to be speaking at cross purposes, and the level of cohesion, policy cohesion and strategic cohesion seems to be missing. We have, for example, at the same time as attempts are to temper the tensions around trade, we have the Secretary of War literally trying to pour oil onto or fuel onto the fire, metaphorically speaking, in terms of tensions in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea and in the West Pacific generally. So I often get the sense that the current US administration does not actually have a core strategic focus. The agencies themselves tend to operate a little bit on autopilot, where the instruments and mentalities and muscle memory of the permanent state apparatuses tend to drive the show, and so we end up with what is in effect a very incoherent government administration. It's very unhelpful for everybody trying to deal with them, because you literally don't know what you're going to get.
Given that has happened, do you do you think this ceasefire would help? Because we had a ceasefire agreement previously, it was broken, it led to the second round escalation. Now, what is a possibility that the Trump administration will not do anything to aggravate the current trade issue again in the next 12 months?
Well, 12 months is a long time. I mean, look what the last 9 months has given us, right? So the idea that over the course of the next 365 days, we're not going to have indiscretions, even if unintentional, that's a very low probability proposition. I think that there is every chance that along the way we're going to see flare-ups. And I saw reports earlier today from Bloomberg that there are some investigations continuing, which in a sense lays the groundwork for the imposition of other kinds of restrictive trade measures. So there's always something that drives the permanent state in America, which is very much focused around preserving its economic and political primacy globally and maintaining, in effect, its hegemony. Now, none of those aspirations, I think, are deliverable today. The world's changed in ways that make all of those aspirations fantasies. But that doesn't stop the machinery of state continuing to grind away, particularly when, if you take a good look at the dynamics on Capitol Hill, there are very, very few members of Congress or in the Senate who you would describe as particularly pragmatic or reasonable when it comes to questions to do with China. On the contrary, there's a lot of hawks across both sides of the corridor, and I think Trump in the administration itself, or the executive, will face incredible political pressures domestically to seek to reassert their ability to shape the agenda, because clearly the agenda on the questions of trade at the moment are not being shaped autonomously by the White House.
It looks like it's almost a full rolling back of the Trump administration trade agenda since April. First you have the rolling back of like the BIS 50% rule. They promised to suspend it for 12 months in exchange for China to suspend their additional export control on rare earth for 12 months. And but in addition, Trump also cut the so-called fentanyl tariff uh, by half by saying, "Oh, because China had promised to work with us on fentanyl." But China has always promised to cooperate with the United States on fentanyl. So this sounds like definitely a cave-in to me. And all in all, now the additional amount of tariff that was placed in China compared to before April 2nd is somewhere about 16%, which is comparable to, say, the new tariff that was placed on countries like UK or even Japan, who are ostensibly U.S. allies. How is Trump gonna, like? I'm assuming there are people who are driven the Trump policy in the first place. How is Trump going to justify this walkback?
Well, I think he'll basically say that there are tariffs in place and that was what he was after. And you'll get people who will focus on this sort of transactional nature of describing what happened, which is that, tariffs are now in place when they weren't beforehand, and that will be considered a win. Overreaching on the claim was to provide negotiating room to get to where you really want to. Let's take that at face value. It's actually still not particularly relevant from an economic policy point of view. Because let's face it, if the economic policy objective was to, firstly, reduce the trade deficit with China, secondly, shift production from China to other parts of the world, and from America's point of view, preferably to America, then the current levels of tariffs being applied will not do any of that. So you've got a question of the relative tariffs between the tariffs applied on Chinese goods and the tariffs applied on goods from other parts of the world. And if the differential isn't high enough, Chinese goods will remain incredibly competitive, and ultimately there will be no incentive mechanism for enterprises to make those long-term capital allocation decisions to shift production from China to other parts of the world, firstly. Secondly, we're not going to see a dramatic shift in productive capacity from around the world generally to investing in America, because at the end of the day, the costs of doing so, the risks involved and the time delays simply don't warrant the move, given that in essence, no single country has been disadvantaged against others. They have all been relatively impacted together as far as countries of origin is concerned. So, relative and absolute tariff levels really don't help the actual policy agenda, if that policy agenda was a serious one. The last thing is that despite the headline tariff rates that have been applied, much of the devil is in the detail, Carl, because there have been a whole raft of exemptions over the period of the last 7 months, category by category, as things get taken off. Things that aren't actually made in the United States, they're just being taken off. The United States now speaking about needing to bring in more beef from Argentina because they've got supply side constraints, which are leading to inflationary pressures on beef in the North American market. All of these point to a recognition that tariffs applied the way that they were actually lead to higher costs. And so the exemptions are starting to deal with that. The other interesting thing, I think, is if we go back to the 2nd of April, when the Liberation Day tariffs were first announced, they were announced with the rationale that these were reciprocal, right? Now, we know that they weren't reciprocal. That's the first thing. And within a day, it was demonstrated that they were generated by virtue of a very simplistic and largely meaningless formula, right? So we've just had this arbitrary way of calculating the first bunch of tariffs. And then after that, it's literally been an arbitrary modification ever since. These tariffs were never serious, really. They were a political move that, of course, demonstrated to the domestic base a willingness of the administration to, do the work and take the tough action, on all of those countries that had been taking advantage of America. But because they hadn't been actually thought through, we've witnessed the unraveling of this, actually a very counterproductive policy apparatus. Americans have not been made better off as a result of all of these moves. And that's the bottom line. American enterprises are paying more today than they were 7 months ago. Importers are absorbing 2/3 of the price increase, and as time goes by, they will be compelled to pass those on. So none of this has been helpful to the enterprise of rejuvenating and restructuring the American economy. And so how does Trump, in the end, explain all of that? Well, I think he simply explains that by the fact that he, got the Chinese to buy some soybeans. He got a 12-month stay on the rare earth question, and there's a bunch of tariffs that are still there, and therefore, he's achieved something.
Now, we still have one unresolved issue from this the last trade spat, which is the whole Dutch government seizing Nesperia. Now, that was necessitated by the BIS 50% rule rolled out by the Trump administration. They basically told the Dutch government, look, because Nesperia is owned by the Chinese parent company, so it falls under the BIS 50% rule. So if you're not going to do anything, we're going to place it on the entity list, and you can end up losing all these jobs that Nesperia employ. So Dutch government went to the whole length of actually seizing the company from the Chinese parent company Wintech, and that caused a cascade of events, including Chinese government is now telling the manufacturing side of Nesperia that's still inside China, saying, okay, you have to prioritize to supply domestic suppliers in China, domestic manufacturers in China, and everyone else will just have to wait. And that led to a huge supply chain shortage in semiconductors, particularly in auto industry. That led to the German automaker, Japanese automakers, and American automaker to announce that they're only weeks away from running out of semiconductors, and including Honda just shut down their Mexican plant because of that. So now that whole initial reason that kicked off this chain of events, the BIS 50% rule just got rolled back by Trump administration. What do you think? What do you think the Dutch would do?
Well, if I was the Dutch, I'd feel terribly used and terribly naive and incredibly embarrassed. I doubt that they'll feel any of that, of course, but the behaviour of the Dutch government and its ascension to American pressure really showed a lack of foresight and a lack of strategic agility in dealing with what potentially was going to be actually a very complex issue, bearing in mind that everybody knew that there were discussions happening between the Chinese side and the Americans anyway, right? So with that happening in the backdrop, and with all the talk about a possible summit between the US and Chinese presidents, you would have thought that anybody with an ounce of strategic experience and foresight would have anticipated that this issue may actually become part and parcel of these deliberations, and perhaps holding fire a little bit would have been the prudent thing to do. But the Dutch, of course, wanted to prove their immediate loyalty and leapt to action. We've had other Dutch political figures who I think have demonstrated some interesting characteristics which maybe aren't representative of Dutch politicians generally, but certainly have, I think, shone a certain light on at least some Dutch political figures. We've had, former national leader Rutte now talking about Trump as daddy. That frankly is belittling for the Dutch people and highly embarrassing for a grown man. We've had the Dutch government respond to this Nesperia question really in ways that showed zero prudence and zero foresight. So what do they do now? Well, there are talks happening between the Europeans and the Chinese on this question of the rare earths. And if I was the Dutch, I would be hoping that this issue is going to get resolved sooner rather than later. But China, I think, demonstrated a couple of things in this process. One was that it wasn't going to brook any nonsense, right? And it's done this consistently throughout, the course of 2025. It's just not going to back down in the face of all of these provocations that are being thrown at it. The second thing too is it actually shines a light on how global supply chains in 2025 are complex things, right? The things that, human societies and economic systems manufacture are complicated. They involve parts and inputs from all over the world that often we just take for granted and don't think about. There is something quite miraculous about how these global supply chains actually work, and we end up with a phone or a computer or a car, made. But the complexity of these systems is actually well known. And China, through its ability to impose export controls in China on the local production plant, actually just reminded the world that you've got to be careful when you sort of leap to these politically driven decisions. And this is the madness of all of this, is that the disruptions to production affects business incomes and it affects the livelihoods of working people. Those workers in those factories, whether it's VW or Nissan or Honda or Ford, that could be affected by disruptions to the Nexperia supply chain. These are real people. And if a political leadership can't actually have at the forefront of their mind the potential downstream implications on the livelihoods, the job stability of their citizens, then, you've got to wonder, why it is that they continue to hold these positions that they do.
Well, this led me to my next question because the Trump trade policy has caused a lot of disruption in normal business flows. And for example, all these companies have tried to move their supply chain out of China in response to the Liberation Day announcement back in April. Now they find themselves wasted a whole bunch of time, money, and effort because now at the current tariff level, as you mentioned, it didn't make sense to move production out of China. I was under the impression the United States is a society where money runs the politics. Money, it ultimately it's a capital that dictates to the politicians. How is it we're now in a situation where the Trump administration is allowed to basically wreak havoc to the whole business ecosystem? I know that they're responding to certain political pressure about, decline of the United States vis-a-vis rise of China. But at the same time, a lot of multinationals from U.S. are still making tons of money head over heel in China. Why? How was it that Donald Trump administration was allowed to take a sledgehammer to this whole enterprise?
Hubris. Well, at the end of the day, it's an incapacity to understand the complex interconnectivity of these economic systems today and this unbridled belief in the righteousness of one's actions. It's literally hubris leads you to make these kinds of very self-destructive and bad decisions. I get the fact that, today's administration in the United States looks out there at the country and sees significant and growing pockets of social and economic malaise and discontent. I understand that there is a belief that the United States has hollowed out its industrial foundations and that many people feel a loss of sort of connectivity and groundedness in the things around them. That's entirely understandable as a sort of set of symptoms of what's gone on for 40 to 50 years. But the kinds of answers that were offered actually made things worse. Right? This is the folly of sort of a politics of nostalgia. So you've got hubris, you've got nostalgia, and you've just got this unbridled sense of sort of right. And when you've got that, almost as if it's a politics of a sovereign as opposed to the politics of an executive constrained by checks and balances, then invariably these kinds of offbeat decisions get made. The other thing to remember is that the dominant forces of capital that drive American politics is not industrial capital anyway, right? So the disruptions to it is seen to be relatively minor. The dominant forms of capital is finance capital and technology capital. And it's those that actually ultimately dictate the priorities and the terms of the American body politic. So, it's misguided, nostalgic, hubristic.
Okay, I'm gonna drill in deeper a little bit on that topic. Why is it then? Why would the finance capital or tech capital in US uh, have a hostile view toward China? I mean, like because uh, can they just? What's wrong with just settle down and do business?
Well, finance capital actually doesn't, right? One of the interesting things about finance capital is that it actually makes most of its money through the circulation of fictitious capital. It just trades paper. And so it largely dictates terms. And one of the problems for the United States administration is that it's actually the dominance of finance capital that has undermined industrial capital over the last 50 years. Efforts to try to do something about this doesn't directly affect finance capital, so it shrugs its shoulders because nobody's actually pulling finance capital, back to earth and bringing it to heel. So long as they don't get affected directly, in many regards, they don't care that much. They continue to do what they do. The other interesting feature, of course, is you've got to look at the rest of the policy framework that has been rolled out in the last 6 months, and I speak particularly to the big beautiful bill. Right, so the big beautiful bill, in effect, created another round of system liquidity expansion as the American government expanded its own deficits. And what happens with system liquidity expansions in the United States is that most of that funnels through the circuits of fictitious capital, in the US stock market in particular, but also into real estate. So we've seen the S&P 500 continue to expand off the back of liquidity flowing into actually only a handful of companies. And we know what those handful of companies are. They are those companies related to AI, whether they're in the hardware side or in the software side. So you've got this nexus between finance capital and technology capital, together with a burgeoning government deficit that actually feeds liquidity into the things that matter to them. They don't care really about what happens elsewhere, provided that those circuits and those dynamics aren't affected. So that's the way I would tend to look at all of this, is that Trump was able to go and do all of these things, not because the others wanted him to, but because the others didn't care whether he did or didn't.
Oh, that's a great point. You brought up AI. Now, Powell just recently came out and say, "Oh, the recent current investment into AI is no way equivalent to the dot-com bubble of the 2000s," which I thought was funny because I look at the two and there's glaring similarities when. When the dot-com bubble back then clearly ran ahead of what the technology back then could deliver. And that sees very similar thing with AI today. They're promising the world with AGI, yet whatever with even hundreds of billions of dollars investment into data centers and the AI revolution, we're seeing actually very little that kind of justify the level of investment that's going in right now. How long? How? I mean, it's. How do you think this will eventually be rationalized?
Well, there's likely to be a significant market correction, as they say, or the bursting of the bubble. The problem is that the promises are overrunning the capacity of the real world to deliver, and the evidence of that is the absence of viable scaling business models for a whole bunch of this activity. Industrial applications in the United States are relatively modest, and that in any case isn't really the focus of a lot of these publicly listed AI companies. They're more interested in things like either pursuing godlike or God-inspired fantasies of AGI, or they're into trying to monetize AI via AI-enabled video sharing apps, the AI version of TikTok, if you will. Or recently, as Sam Altman announced, they're going to release an age-restricted version of chat, right, which basically is trying to, grab into the business model and revenue flows of things like OnlyFans. If this is the business model for American AI, then it's going to be limited as far as its ability to deliver on the promises that have been made. And when that starts to materialize, we are going to see investors vacate. They will take profit. One of the things about these sorts of booms is that at some point, large amounts of stockholders will exit the stock and take their profit, monetize it, and move on. And it happened, as you say, in 2000, with the dot-com boom. But let's not forget, this was the problem in 2008 as well, with the property boom. At some point, it came to an end when the real world was not able to substantiate the promises that were being made by the world of finance. That's where it's going to end up. The other issue that's going to become a real constraint on AI is going to come from the United States' inability to resolve its energy problems. AI is, of course, an energy-hungry sector. Arguably, AI is really just a manifestation of energetic capabilities within your economy. And the United States energy system is both old and fragmented. Its attempt to augment so that it can meet the demands of the artificial intelligence industry is actually putting strains on the system at large, either by pulling energy or electricity away from other uses, driving up prices in the market, which has short-term effects on consumers and other industrial users. But it also has what we call Dutch disease consequences, which is they create structural shifts in the demand for resources in the economy at large, and it will draw a whole bunch of resources away from other industrial activities towards AI and towards solving a problem for AI. What that means is that those other sectors end up becoming relatively undeveloped, and certainly undeveloped compared to what they otherwise would have been. So we have a contradiction between the expansion of AI and ambitions around rejuvenating American manufacturing, because manufacturing, modern manufacturing that is intensely energy intensive. Without energy, without electricity, without artificial intelligence, ironically, and without automation, you don't actually get the kind of manufacturing that can only take place in a place like the United States. We're not going to see more manual labor intensive sweatshops emerge in the United States. They already exist, right? But we're not going to get more of them. The only prospects for modern industry in the United States is high-tech, energy-intensive, AI-driven, automated. So we've got contradictions now. The Energy Secretary, some weeks ago, talked about America facing a 100 gigawatt energy deficit over the next 5 years that needed to be plugged. Well, good luck. There's probably a good chance that the system as a whole can achieve half of that. And it's not that there lacks ambition, and it's not that there lacks money capital. The problem is that the physical and human skills required to pull that off are simply not available in the quantities necessary in the time available. It's as simple as that. You can't manufacture enough skills that are needed for the kind of work that must be done if the American electricity system is going to expand in the order that's been talked about. There's simply not enough of the equipment, whether they're the equipment that goes into transformers, that they're just not there. So these are the constraints. Welcome to reality in a sense. The real economy, the world of physics, the world of materials, and the world of human capabilities ultimately is going to dictate how fast and how successful the United States is going to be able to resolve these bottleneck problems. And I think it's going to really struggle.
Well, you did mention energy, but isn't U.S. incredibly rich in hydrocarbon resources? And in fact, Trump is going 100% in on big oil right now. He's ditching all these federal subsidies on sustainable energy and saying let's just drill. Couldn't expanded production of maybe shale gas or shale oil make up for the shortfall in energy? And ultimately, it doesn't matter where the energy come from, whether from the sun or from the fossil fuels.
Well, there's a few issues in all of that. One is that it's likely that the shale oil reserves, in terms of the energy return on energy invested curve, if you will, we've already gone over the top, meaning that future resources are going to take more and more effort to extract, which means you need a higher and higher price as well for activity to be undertaken. So there's a challenge at the moment because current pricing for oil is nowhere near high enough to justify folk in the oil business to commit the resources that you need to extract the next or to open up the next set of wells. So that's the problem, right? We need prices in the order of $80 a barrel. They're nowhere near that. And again, there's trade-offs involved because you've got the economics that justify expansion of some of the more difficult and increasingly expensive shale oil projects. You've also got an impact on downstream impact on consumers with gasoline costs, but also for other industries. So we've got trade-offs that take place in that sector alone. But converting hydrocarbons, particularly in terms of oil, into electricity useful for the AI industry, still requires a significant investment in infrastructure, and those bottlenecks remain. So just because you have rich sources, original sources of materials, doesn't necessarily mean you can build out the supply chain infrastructure that you need to extract, convert, and deliver. So I think that there are some real constraints. The broader issue, Carl, and this is one that I tend to think is the sort of really big picture strategic challenge facing the United States, is that the United States has, for the past 150 years, developed on the back of the ability to access incredibly high energy return on energy invested energy sources and systems, right? When you could get oil cheap and 1 barrel of oil equaled so many, years of man effort. I mean, that was an incredible transformative resource for a national economy. But those easy days are actually behind us, and the United States is now in a position where its hydrocarbon resources are on the downward side of the EROEI curve, and that's going to become very, very problematic over the next 10 to 20 years. It's one of these things where I think the politics of energy, which sees a commitment to maintaining known approaches to energy and an ideological reaction to the renewables and other things, actually is hampering the United States' ability to make rational choices based on all available options.
But let's be devil's advocate for a second. You mentioned there will be industrial bottleneck for U.S. to build out its power grid. Well, couldn't just import from China? Couldn't just import the equipment from China?
Well, this assumes that they will import equipment from China. That there will still be bottlenecks because China is obviously supplying a lot of this equipment to many systems around the world that are developing their own energy distribution networks, and it isn't that easy to just flip the switch and increase production outputs by 20-30% to cater for America's needs. So there will be production bottlenecks regardless, and the extent to which they exist, I guess, in part is going to be reflected in whether or not Americans pay more to, jump the queue, so to speak, and whether or not Chinese manufacturers will respond to that, which they probably will, unless there are strategic directives to, in a sense, commit to some of the larger scale energy distribution projects that China might get more involved in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. So, that's the sort of trade-off questions again. I mean, there are no easy answers in all of this stuff. So, I mean, mainstream economics often forgets that in the practical world, everything always takes time. And they sort of think, oh, well, supply demand will adjust and there'll be some, magic process of market clearing at a new price. It does assume, of course, that things are just sitting around waiting for you to just flip a switch and miraculously make it all available. That's not how the real world works.
Okay, but so how did United States get into this position? Because there was once upon a time, United States did reinvent itself. We saw that in the second industrial revolution. We saw that in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And United States, once upon a time, was very capable of investing its own infrastructure and put together the pool of human capital that's able to execute. So what changed?
Well, we've had growing financialization for 50 years. So if you look at the energy outputs in the United States, they've largely flatlined for 20 odd years. Right? The United States doesn't actually produce any more electricity than it did today, really, than it did 20 odd years ago. Its systems, to some extent, have become a little bit more efficient, but the change in the structure of its economy in terms of its demand for electricity has changed too. So as it evolved into an economic system which was more services oriented, it actually required far less electricity outputs to support that kind of industrial structure. And there are legacy consequences to this, and they accumulate over time. Old systems systems get old. They're not maintained as they once were. Accountants, particularly in publicly listed companies, will often find ways to sweat assets, in other words, defer maintenance, because that looks much better financially. But these actions eventually catch up with breakdowns and in due course obsolescence. So these aren't things that you can say, at some point an error got made and therefore, we can just blame something. These were sort of systemic transformations that took place in the American the political economy of North America. So about 50 years ago, the economic system in the United States began to explore offshoring opportunities. And we saw a lot of that take place in Japan, on the island of Taiwan, the Philippines, and places like that, where American capital established operations in these places and began exporting back to the United States. That was already happening, by the sort of late 1950s, early 1960s. By the 1970s, if you go back and read some of the policy literature and the academic research at the time, there were already concerns about American manufacturing being hollowed out. So this has been an ongoing problem. And as you hollow out industry, or as industry structures change, the nature of an economy changes. So the skills that used to be needed to work in shop floors and things, they disappear over time. People go and do other things. They're not renewed. The education system adapts because those kind of requirements are no longer there. And we see the emergence of whole new classes of employment. Wall Street, financial engineers, et cetera, and they become incredibly attractive. And as people, go through an education system and get more skilled, where do they orient their activities? Well, even the engineers that graduated from some of America's best engineering schools have found themselves working in Wall Street. They don't work as engineers. They don't work in research and development, whether they're chemical engineers or structural engineers or hydraulic engineers or what have you. They actually all end up in Wall Street. So these are systemic changes that happened over the course of the last 50 years. They've been accelerated by some government policies, particularly policies around the deregulation of the financial markets and decoupling or enabling actually the banks to be both savings and loans institutions as well as investment banks. And so we now have an American political economy that in many regards, just over time through processes of transformation and evolution, is a services dominated system with a heavy financialized overhead.
Now, the question from that, obviously, can that process be reversed? I know if I ask Donald Trump, he will say yes, but whatever he has done so far is not really helping. But suppose we have a more rational leader in place, is it possible for that process to be replaced? Because the process of deindustrialization you're describing doesn't just affect the United States. This affects countries, UK as well. Many former leaders in industrial revolution now is going through the same process of decaying and deindustrialization. Now, is it possible for that process to be reversed?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned these other places, Carl, because when I was cutting my teeth as a postgraduate researcher, some of the first work I was doing in the early 1990s was on this problem of deindustrialization in Italy, UK and all of those things. So these aren't new problems, right? I think that the other way of framing this is, rather than reindustrialization, which often implies somehow reclaiming what's been lost, the only way to think about this is what future industrialization looks like. There is no winding back the clock unless you want to dramatically transform the structure of an economy in ways that will reduce living standards. We know this because the processes of evolution to date has actually led to progressively higher living standards for a lot of people. And I say that recognizing that the United States social settlement now actually has a lot of people for whom life hasn't improved for many decades, partly associated with all of those dynamics I was describing earlier, and for whom, in fact, it's gotten a lot worse, with 60+% of people living paycheck to paycheck, with food security being a problem for 14% of American households, for 20+% of households now skipping meals to be able to pay rent or mortgages. Motor vehicle loans, delinquency rates are rising back to levels that we haven't seen for 20 years. Ditto credit card loans, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly American households, particularly working households, are under incredible pressure. So the American body politic, if you will, I think has reached a point where the anxieties and anger that have been percolating and accumulating for 40 to 50 years have spilled over, which is why we have the political phenomena that we do. Promising those people that you can turn the clock back and go back to how the world was in 1955 with Fordism, single income earner households, 2 kids, front yard, and all those things. Well, that's fantasy land stuff. And as much as that kind of nostalgia mobilizes voters to get out and vote, in the end, it also sets them up for massive disappointment. The only way, in my view, for the United States to transform its economic structure is to focus on what technology can actually do and harness technology in ways that deliver new kinds of jobs that are high value adding and which enable people to have high quality work and life relationships, right? So, how does North America train a workforce that's capable of doing these things, right? What are the investments that need to be made? Let's take shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is a complicated business these days. The United States hasn't really been in the business of making ships for 70 years. It began undermining its shipbuilding industry, ironically, in the 1920s when it introduced legislation to protect shipbuilding. And by protecting shipbuilding, it created massive disincentives for innovation and productivity improvements. So if America wants to rebuild a shipbuilding industry, rather than simply approving Korean shipbuilders to build nuclear submarines in North America, which is what's happened in the last week or so, we now have a situation where you've got to commit to rebuilding an entire maritime workforce. Right? Building ships needs skills of certain types. None of them really exist in America by any stretch of the imagination. Is the US political and education system set up to enable those things to happen? And if that was the pathway that was necessary, That's a 20 to 30 year commitment, right, Carl? The other thing you've got to remember is over the last 30, 40 years, American literacy and numeracy standards have fallen. Now, how do you have a modern industrial workforce that suffers from low literacy and low numeracy standards? Well, you can't. China's ability to eventually become the industrial power that it is today is premised on the fact that from 1949 to today, literacy has gone from 20% to 95, 96%. That's what's happened, right? So unless you're willing to do the things needed to turn around literacy and numeracy and then create the skills necessary for these industries, the industries aren't going to come back unless you're willing to import the workers, right, from other parts of the world. And I'm not sure at the moment that the politics of importing workers in America plays in a way that makes this easy to do.
Very well said. This has been a fascinating conversation, Dr. Warwick. We have covered a whole range of subjects. If people want to follow your work, where would they go?
Probably two little places. One is my Substack, which is warwickpowell.substack.com, where I try to publish something about once a week. Every now and then I accidentally publish two things, but certainly I don't want people to have high expectations that there'll be that on a regular basis, but roughly once a week. And the other place is I have my own little channel for very different kinds of discussions, mainly far more technical around global South economic development, and that is TIO Talks with Warwick Powell. So they're the two places that you can have a little bo peep at the things that I do and the things that I guess concern myself and the people that I work with.
Well, there you have it, Dr. Warwick Powell. Thank you for making your time to join us today. And thanks everyone listening, tuning in. Please follow Dr. Warwick, follow his work, and leave your comments below on what you would like to see next. Thanks, guys.